Hello and welcome. We're at the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and start our webinar for today. I am Melanie Ross, and I will be the facilitator of our webinar. Our presenter is Ingrid Flemming. Thank you for joining ANAB for our complimentary webinar on proficiency testing, a different approach pushing for technical satisfaction. Please note that we are recording this webinar, so it will be available for viewing in the future. Some logistics before we get started. Due to the attendance, everyone will remain muted for the duration of the webinar. If you would like to participate in any of the questions that are being asked, or if you have a question, feel free to use the raise hand feature to be unmuted to participate. You can also enter your comments into the chat or submit questions via the Q&A box. Our presenter today again is Ingrid Flemming. She is a career scientist and is the founding director of IFM Quality Services Ltd, a PTP provider based in Australia. Over the last 27 years, Ingrid's passion for meaningful quality has allowed her to assist laboratory leaders to get more from the activities laboratories undertake for their accreditation. She is a firm believer that quality is a human endeavor that requires human commitment and understanding. Fostering this attitude is the key to success. With that, I am going to go over to Ingrid's presentation and turn it over to her for her to begin the webinar.
Hi, everybody. As Melanie said, my name's Ingrid Flemming. This is my first WebEx for ANAB. Have you ever had stage fright? You know, that feeling that people are watching you or listening to you or going to inspect what you're going to say. Yeah, that's right. That's me right now. It's also 4 o'clock in the morning in Sydney. So excuse me if I'm a little bit unusual. Anyway, I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you all. As Melanie said, I'm passionate about quality. I was converted to the concept almost 40 years ago when I worked for a water treatment company. So my technical background is in the life sciences, but running proficiency testing programs for almost the last 30 years has shown me that laboratory quality concepts apply to every scientific discipline. And the broad types of dramas and dilemmas that come from running proficiency testing programs applies actually in exactly the same way to every scientific discipline. The reason that I'm passionate about quality is because at the end of the day, it's systems and procedures that get us through. There's lots of room for professionalism. Quality doesn't take the place of professionalism, which is a common thing that I hear. But systems and procedures help professionals do their work better and more reliably. So quality only works when it's discussed for functionality. You have to design your quality systems to be functional for your lab, for your application. And too many times I see people who just do the basic stuff that's written in 17025. They write their procedure because they think that it's important to have that particular one, and they have an assessment by their accreditor who tells them that they've got to fill a hole, and so they just fill that one little hole, which just means that they've got to do more and more little things to make everything work and fit together. That's actually a really non-functional and expensive way to approach things. When you approach quality as a bunch of human beings who are trying to make everything work, it tends to work better. And that might seem really vague and airy-fairy, but hopefully as we go through the presentation today, we'll have a different perspective on things, particularly proficiency testing. So can we talk about why your laboratory exists? What's the main work in your lab? Who do you work for? And I'm not asking who your boss is. I'm asking who the people are that need to get the results from your laboratory. And then we can talk about the team of analysts that are in the lab. So what are they there for? Are they there to get through the work? Are they there to process as many samples as possible? Or maybe they're there to provide the information that the test submitter has requested. So if they're there to provide the information that the test submitter has requested, does it matter whether their results are correct or not? And what could happen if an incorrect result is reported to a customer? Melanie, could I just get your input for a second, please?
Yes.
The presentation has some animation in it. So given that this slide doesn't have the blocks, that all of those points should have come up separately. Are the rest of them going to be the same? Just to give me a heads up, because some of the slides won't work.
Yes, that's the way that they're going to come up is the slide by itself without the animation.
Oh, would I be able to show the slides with the animation?
Absolutely. If you want to pull it up and share your screen, you can do that.
Just a moment. Let me do. Have to work up to my screen.
So once you have the presentation pulled up on your computer, you'll go up to share, and then you can select my screen or an application. And then everyone will see your screen rather than what's in WebEx itself.
Okay. Okay, my screen. So can you see my screen?
No, I'm still seeing the WebEx screen right now. Let me minimize it and bring it back up. Oh, it's starting to share now. It just took it a second.
All right, so
I see it.
I'll take some, yeah. I would like people to think about what the work is of their lab and to think about, actually, are you also getting this little box on the side, or is that not there? There's a little box on my screen that says it's someone speaking and
no, I do
no,
not see that. I do not see that
okay.
box. I just see your screen.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. We'll just carry on. So I'd like everyone to think about whether it matters whether their test results are right or not. And then to ask themselves what could happen if an incorrect test result is reported to a customer. So when we've thought about that concept, how does proficiency testing fit into the role of the laboratory? I bet a lot of you think it's just that pain, that compulsory pain that we all have to go through to prove that we're competent. Or there could be the usual reasons, which are the things that you hear all the time, but then I think lots of people don't really believe these reasons, and they include that it could be a gauge to see how everyone aligns. It could be a signal that gives confidence that everything the lab is doing is on track. It could also be the thing that makes the accreditation body believe that we're competent. It could be a quick checkbox way of meeting our accreditation requirements. And it could be something that helps identify training needs, something that generates opportunities for improvement. So when we look at what 17025 says, I'm sure that you've all read this before, but I'll just quickly read it out. The laboratory needs to monitor its performance by comparison with results of other labs. The monitoring needs to be planned and reviewed and shall include but not be limited to proficiency testing, whether it's official proficiency testing or some other form of interlaboratory comparison. And then it says data from monitoring activities shall be analysed and they'll be used to control and, if applicable, to improve the laboratory's activities. And the results of the analysis of the data from monitoring activities, if they're found to be outside the predefined criteria, then appropriate action needs to be taken to prevent incorrect results from being reported. So it says proficiency testing has to be planned and it has to be reviewed. And it doesn't say that proficiency testing needs to be panicked over or be a source of stress. Yet it seems to be that all the time. I wonder why that is. It might be something to do with stage fright. Someone's watching. So many times the PTP arrives like highly anticipated precious cargo. It's treated like gold and is put into the care of the best analyst. And the whole exercise is viewed with trepidation. And throughout the process, everyone knows that this is the PT sample. Extra care might be taken to ensure that all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Additional control tests might be added to the usual daily regime, when the test could be set up more than once by more than one person and checked twice or 3 times more frequently than what is usual. So does that activity help the laboratory manager know whether their everyday test results are correct? So I'm going to ask a question. If the laboratory management requires or tolerates additional things to be done with respect to the PT test or the report, what is the management telling their staff about the adequacy of what they do every day? So can you imagine if people are going, oh, this is the PT sample, you can't send a wrong result for the PT. You've got to do extra stuff to make sure that the result is correct. Does that mean that the quality of the rest of the work that gets done every day isn't up to the same standard? Is the outcome of the PTP more important than sending a correct result to a routine customer? And will a bad PTP outcome cause a disease outbreak or a product recall or a patient death? Is everybody nodding or shaking their heads? Okay, so after the test results are submitted, then we wait and we worry. And it's usually the person who's been in the hot seat, they're the ones who feel that they're just hanging out waiting for that result to come through. And then when the performance evaluation arrives, it might be a huge relief to everybody, or it could be something that's not the same as that. What if the lab gets a fail assessment? What happens then? Well, I'd be asking how real was the PT in comparison to the everyday work? How many additional steps were required before the PT sample looked like something that the laboratory normally gets? And you could ask whether the sample ever looked like something the laboratory normally tests. And did the laboratory get put through its paces, or did they just focus on the one thing? So we're coming back to this slide. There's an assumption that PT is somehow representative of everything that the laboratory normally does. The onus is therefore actually on choosing providers that give PTP that mimics an actual practice as closely as possible. Because if the lab gets an outlier, the reason for the outlier could be either that the lab has some part of their system out of control, or that they were doing things that were completely different to what they normally do. So if the results were outside predefined criteria, that's what it says in the standards. Ask yourself, what do you mean? Whose criteria are they? So then you have to start asking yourself, who's in control here? Do we let the PT provider be in control? Or does the laboratory need to be in control of its own destiny? Usually if the lab does not set any criteria of its own, well then the PT provider criteria are taken as a default. But there's nothing to say that the PT criteria need to be taken as a default. Now, before you all put your hands up and say, hang on, this isn't what happens in daily life. Well, I know it's not what happens in daily life because I hear about it almost every day. Is it the PTP provider's job to decide what level of accuracy or precision is right for your lab? And what does the PTP provider know about your lab? So just me. Say, for example, you join one of our programs. Would we know enough about your lab to know that the results that the lab submitted were different? Would we know enough to know whether they were different enough to be significant? Now, we're going to come back to this slide at the end. I just am putting it here so that it can, maybe marinate a little bit. I just think that people often take the PT provider as a judge. PT provider is not a judge. Okay, so in summary, so far we've established that an error in normal daily testing potentially has far greater ramifications in terms of causing harm to humans than a PTP error. And frequently, PTP samples are handled in a manner that's completely different to normal daily testing. We've also established that when test work is handled so differently, the PT result may not necessarily be reflective of the accuracy of daily testing work. Now, it could be that their PTP results are far more accurate, and it could also be that the PTP results are less accurate. However, one has to ask oneself then that if, why would we bother to do PT when they're relatively expensive to engage in? There's certainly a cause of stress. Even our own laboratory staff are highly aware that this is a PT sample. Relatively, proficiency testing takes a lot of lab time and resources. This is in comparison to other tests. Frequently, the PT are not representative and potentially, therefore, they have very little gain. It provides very little benefit in those circumstances. We need to focus on technical satisfaction. So I'm trying to sow some seeds so that we can look at proficiency testing a little bit differently. I'm a quality person. So my immediate reaction is to do things like root cause analyses when things aren't right. You might be saying that, well, running a PT program or engaging in a PT program isn't a non-conformity, especially not when the assessment is right. And normally you would do some kind of quality analysis like a root cause analysis because there's been a non-conformity. But actually there has been a non-conformity because the non-conformity is that a quality activity is getting carried out that is not giving any benefit to the lab or not enough benefit to the lab. For the money spent, the time taken processing the samples and then doing all of the necessary work behind it, it actually means that you're spending money and time. They're financial risks to the business that can't be ignored. So the usual reason that laboratories don't get optimal benefit from PT is because they treat PT completely different to daily testing. And so if we think about the contributors of towards differential treatment, well, one of them is that samples get handled differently to usual. So they might use additional controls, do more checks and more duplicates. Well, could be an option to encourage staff to do only what is normal in the lab, because what they do every day is good enough, unless you're telling them it's not. PT is also a non-routine, infrequent activity, and the one solution to that problem, although it might not be that popular, is to make PT so routine and so frequent that staff do not see it as different. Well, that would mean, obviously, that you need to source some affordable and comprehensive PT services that allow the staff to be involved. It also means that staff get over the idea of special handling. There could be other solutions to the non-routine, infrequent activity. And then there are psychological stresses on analysts and their managers which contribute to this situation. But I really believe that addressing the above two items will assist staff to avoid some of the stresses. And so will the next things that we're talking about. Proficiency testing is suboptimal when the required sample preparation, sample processing, or test volume don't resemble daily work. So examples of sample differences, especially for microbiology, I see this all the time. The contents of this freeze-dry vial represent 25 grams of food or whatever. That isn't normal. And the number of tests that get offered is also frequently not the usual thing. Here, test this sample for listeria. One sample, one test. And then the volume of sample provided for the test is another thing that is different to normal test work. So everyone focuses on the samples, and that's rightly so. Quite frequently when a lab gets an outlier in a proficiency program, their first thing is to say it's the samples. So often when a lab gets the assessment, their first thing is to say, well, we've been running this test day in and day out for years, and we know what we're doing. It couldn't possibly have been us. It must have been the samples. The blame for a PTP bad outcome often goes to the provider for not providing homogeneous and stable samples. The PT provider's job is to assure homogeneity and stability. So collectively, and I'm speaking for every PT provider on the planet, we'd all be failing our duties if we got that bit wrong. But what's frequently not considered is that the samples themselves and their relevance in the laboratory might be contributing to the bad outcome. So we need to focus on what's called the 3 R's. They need to be representative, reliable, and relevant. So when we talk about representative, I thought I might read out the requirements of ISO IEC 17043, which is the requirement that the PTP providers need to meet. It says in our standard that proficiency test items should match in terms of matrix, measurands, concentrations, as closely as practicable the types of items and materials encountered in routine tests or calibration. Most customers that send test work to a lab send real samples, so real food, real tablets, real sludge, whatever they're sending, it's the real thing. In microbiology, unless you're working on a space program for astronaut nutrition, it's highly unlikely that a test for food pathogens would be routinely performed on a freeze-dried vial. And freeze-dried vials in this context would make it even more difficult for a lab to demonstrate that their test techniques for PT samples align with their everyday testing. So the best solution is to provide something as real as possible. Real materials give the lab a better chance of running a PT from end to end with fewer distractions or reminders that someone is going to be paying attention to the end result. I think what people mostly forget is that lab staff also need to be aware that their everyday customers also pay attention to the end result of their daily testing. It isn't actually any different. Melanie, should we pause for a few questions or comments at this point?
If anybody has any comments or questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat or in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you for you to ask your question.
Okay, we'll carry on. Reliable samples. They need to be homogeneous and stable. Well, that's PTP provider job, no matter what. Relevant samples. So procedural and technical relevance is a big thing. Huge deal. Normally, customers that submit samples to a testing lab would send something, more than one sample for testing, something real. They might send something from a sampling plan, so there might be 10 or 20 samples in there, or 3. And they normally request multiple analyses to be conducted on the same sample. But relevance isn't only having a representative sample mix. Relevance also requires proving common technical and administrative challenges that laboratories face in their everyday lives. So that means correctly identifying the samples, booking them in. If you have samples A, B, and C, you have to test sample A, sample B, and sample C and identify them correctly. If you send from a sampling plan A27 and B46, are also correctly identified samples in everyday life. Testing the correct and usual volume of the sample is also really important. I know lots of labs who've got pre-made reagents at the right volume so that it's easy to set up the samples every day. And so if they're normally using those pre-made reagents in their set volumes, and then they get asked to do something completely different for the PT, well, then suddenly they have to actually do extra steps to make their samples relevant. Then performing multiple different analyses on the same samples. So it's seldom that you just get asked in the lab to do a single analysis, or it's not that common. It happens, of course. There's lots of organisations who are only interested in a particular analyte, but it isn't the normal thing. So could you imagine your customer saying, please pretend that this freeze-dried vial is tomato soup, test it for listeria, please test this other freeze-dried vial for salmonella, pretend that it's oatmeal, just test 1 ml of the reconstituted freeze-dried vial in each case and pretend that it's 25 grams of food. That kind of stuff doesn't allow the lab to include all their aspects of their test system while they're engaging in PT. It's also that kind of instruction that inserts a layer of tasks to the analyst that breaks their routine compared to what they do every other day. The addition of non-routine steps immediately changes the focus and the perspective of the testing for the analyst. And that's how it takes the emphasis away from just doing the test correctly. So a sample design needs to be proven to work. So this is from the PT provider perspective. It needs to include relevant ingredients. It needs to provide a suitable challenge. It needs to contain the target measurements. Well, maybe. Normally people engage in a PT so that they can do the test that's required and then have something to measure in that sense. And it needs to be 100% controlled, which is pretty hard ask. But if we just focus on these two boxes in the next slide, we also have to talk about chemistry, microbes, ingredients, interference, corrections, and adjustments. So a pure sample that contains only the target material in its basic form and doesn't have any other ingredients that might affect the analysis is something that CRMs are made of. CRMs are certified reference materials. It's actually unrealistic to expect that a sample from a customer will contain normal ingredients that never have co-contaminants. They never have interfering materials or any other factor that could influence the outcome of a test. And yet quite often PT samples are like that. And so just as the laboratory analyst deals with these interferences in daily life, a PT sample should present reality and not resemble purity, like a CRM. This is my opinion. It's probably would get people worried. CRMs have their very important place in daily tests. So they're used as standalone tests to monitor the running of a test, or as a spike that's added to a sample matrix. But the presentation of a CRM for a proficiency testing purpose doesn't actually do very much to promote technical satisfaction in the PTP arena. CRMs are usually not real-world testing materials. So now we've established a few more things. PTP can be more technically satisfying when the PT samples resemble the real thing that people get every day, in every manner, in composition, in volume, in list of measurands, and in the number of submitted samples. They're also more technically satisfying when the frequency of engagement in PT is higher, because that way the PT is normalized. And staff are discouraged, need to be discouraged from performing additional checks in order to make PTP more relevant. But the real reason that you would discourage staff from performing additional tests for a PT, additional quality, additional tests, additional duplicates, additional everything for PT is because we're promoting to staff that what they do every day is both adequate and suitable.
Ingrid, we do have 2 questions if you'd like to have those questions before you move on to the next topic.
Okay.
It said, and this was just what you were talking about on that slide, should we be doing PT samples continuously to keep them from being treated as the quote-unquote golden sample?
Well, I think so, yes. Some of those PT might be external PT, but you can also run internal PT. PT definitely should not be just treated like a golden sample. It's very difficult to get out of a mindset. I acknowledge that, but definitely PT should be run very frequently.
Okay, and then oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
The second question was, why is this philosophy of PTP continuous sampling not embraced by proficiency test houses globally?
Good question. Just as an example, we've always done it because I actually believe in quality, and we started a PT program in 1999 called Check Sample. And even though I've just been talking about freeze-dry vials, this is actually a freeze-dry vial program, but it runs every month. And there are 13 analytes in that program every month. And when we ran that program for the first time, there were 11 labs enrolled. And of those 11 labs that were first enrolled in 1999, 8 of them are still the same lab, with the same management, the same owner. You know what happens globally these days. Everybody gets gobbled up by everybody else. So 8 of those 11 labs are still the same, essentially the same labs. Some of them have changed names. And those 8 labs have been participating every month since 1999, doing not necessarily all 13 of the analytes that are offered in that PT. But those labs frequently, well, lots of them in the meantime have joined those kinds of programs. They talk about the July IFM, and we actually run several monthly programs now that are running in that way. So I think it's very hard. It's relatively easy to once a year put every bit of effort into 13 analytes so that you can get your PT right. But it's a lot different and bigger exercise to put everything into 13 analytes every single month since 1999. And so the quality people responsible for those labs really have embraced that concept. And so they kind of make it a little bit creative now. So, the lab staff actually put their hand up and say, oh, it's my turn, I'll do this one. Or they might divide those samples up and say, okay, well, Sarah's doing these 3 analyses and John's doing these 4 and somebody else is doing these other ones. So they kind of do it like it's just the routine, it's their thing. And then when they get the answer, it's not always perfect, but they just go through the things that they need to do, and they know at the next month they get to check the next sample, and they'll know whether they're getting more on track or less on track. Did that kind of answer the question? I don't know why other people don't do that.
Great, thank you for that. And then we have an interesting one here. It says, why do most universities and professors not participate in PT, as this imparts to students that PT is not important? It seems to only be embraced by the professional lab community.
I honestly can't answer that question because it's not you'd have to ask them
Right.
why they do that. So,
and I would say that the professional lab community is required to because of their accreditation.
yeah.
Right? So,
I mean, basically, I've done quite a few lectures for universities, and it sort of seems to be in a 3-year or 4-year course. You get to listen to Ingrid for 1 hour during one of the sessions, and that's pretty much the quality training done. So I can kind of see that. I think I'm second guessing, but I think that universities are focusing on the technical aspects of the work. But when we interview job applicants, we actually ask them, they usually come up with a whole list of techniques and exciting things that they know how to do, that they learnt how to do. And our question is always, well, how do you know that your answers are right? So we always ask them in the interview about their quality. So, when you did those things, how did you know that the answers were right? And usually they can't answer. They'd say some things like, oh, we calibrate our equipment, which doesn't even go halfway, not even a quarter of the way to knowing that your answer is right. So, yeah, I think to the person who asked the question about why doesn't it get taught in school, maybe the accreditation community can approach the schools and say, you guys really need to teach quality as well. But I don't have the answer, but it happens in Australia too. So.
Okay, great. Those
Okay.
were all the questions right now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we'll carry on. So I've got 3 boxes here that are blank at the moment, which are things that I think are good conversations to have with your PT provider. The first one is, can we get real samples at realistic volumes that contain real ingredients and which provide realistic test experience for our analysts? Which means no obvious reconstitution or handling requirements beyond what would be usual for daily testing work. I think it's a pretty good question to ask. The next question is probably at the heart of the issue, and that's why it's in the middle of the screen, is can we afford to get PTP at a frequency that enables staff to feel that this is just routine? And the other question that I think is important to ask PT providers is, can we test multiple samples and multiple analytes within the same PT experience, just the same that as our customers send for our daily testing work? I think they're pretty good questions to ask when you talk to your PT provider. There's also conversations, obviously, that need to occur in the lab. This is the big question, is do we need to trust that our existing daily processes are good enough to withstand a proficiency testing program? Wouldn't it suddenly be scary for an analyst to do a PT where they don't do all those extra checks and just trust that what they do every day is good enough? It's the thing that dreams are made of. Can we avoid negative messaging about proficiency testing participation by not requiring additional work, steps, or care to be applied during a PT? Can we avoid purchasing PT where the samples are not representative of reality? I mean, just because they're offered doesn't mean they're good. And can we put more importance on the accuracy of daily test work than on PT accuracy? Because our customers suffer if we don't report correct test results to them. Is that scary? I think it might be. And then there's one more thing. Before we go, I said we were going to come back to this slide. Often IFM is asked about the failure assessments and the criteria and why the Z-score limits are ±3 rather than ±2. They ask us why we have a rule about 75% consensus when we have a categorical result. They ask us all kinds of things about assessments. So I'm going to tell you some truths because these probably apply to every PT program out there. There's actually nothing in ISO IEC 17025 that states that PTP providers take responsibility for deciding when a lab needs to take corrective actions. Nothing. Challenge you to find it. Quality, accuracy, and precision of testing are and should always remain the responsibility of the testing lab. The laboratory's obligations are to provide results to their customers, and those results have to be both correct and they have to be technically appropriate. And the PT provider can't make those decisions for the lab because every lab has different customers. The PT provider's role, given that we're not judging labs, is to provide relevance in interlaboratory comparisons and statistics that enable labs to make appropriate determinations about the comparability of their analyses. Are these concepts a bit foreign to everyone that's listening? Most people sort of go, what the, when we say these things, but these are true. This is the absolute truth. So we could ask why the PTP provider makes the assessments. It's because it's expected. Traditionally, Z-scores have most frequently been used to provide participating labs with a measure of spread of their results from the norm. So if we're talking really simplistically, for a consensus-based PT assessment, a Z-score of 3 really only means that the submitted results that from this one lab that got a Z-score of 3 or more is further away from the assigned value than the value submitted by 99% of the participants. So if those 99% of participants submitted values that are well within your own MU, and your MU is acceptable to your customers, then the impact of a Z-score of 3 on your customers is probably going to be minuscule. On the other hand, though, it doesn't always go in that direction. It could be the other way. If the results of the PTP are extremely varied, and they might span many multiples of your own measurement uncertainty, then a Z-score of 1 could be devastating to your customers. So I'm going to just, in closing, give you 2 cases. So the first case is IFM's meat industry scheme. So this is one of our monthly schemes. This one's not been running since 1999. This one's been running since about 2005. But anyway, the participants in this scheme are a cohort most of these labs do the Australian export meat testing. It's a regulated, something to do with a regulator. So it's a relatively close group, and this group has more or less, some labs leave, some labs come back, some labs close down, some labs join up, whatever. But since 2005, it's been mostly the same group of labs. And they, if you think about where an abattoir is, so these are abattoir laboratories mostly. Usually abattoirs are out in the middle of nowhere. And let me assure you, Australia has lots of nowhere, lots of middles of nowhere where there's just nothing for miles around. And so getting staff to join these laboratories can be very challenging. And a lot of the people who work in these labs have possibly less scientific and technical training than the average lab is populated with that's in a city. But anyway, they're extremely, extremely fussy, and they've built up their skills over the years, and they're extremely particular in the way that they conduct their tests. The group results, these are microbiology tests, and the group results spread might be as small as 10 colonies. So if there's any microbiologists out there, 10 colonies in a count is like nothing. Okay, so it's therefore really easy to get a fail assessment in this particular PT. The export regulator accepts the statistics and the Z-scores yielded by the group, but they have their own assessment criteria. So these are the predefined criteria of 0.5 log. And that's when they decide that corrective actions need to happen. So it doesn't matter what the Z-score is that the lab got. The Z-score is just a statistic. It's just a measure of spread from the norm. But the regulator requires corrective action when the labs are more than 0.5 of a logarithm away from the assigned value. And then we've got case 2. This is an electrical example. So there's a lot of electrical testing labs who have to determine the temperature rise of a product when it's being used. And there have been rounds of this proficiency program where the range of acceptable results was over 45 Kelvin. So Kelvin unit is like Celsius. So when I'm talking about an acceptable range, I'm talking about the Z-score equals 3 plus 3 difference between that and the Z-score equals minus 3 result is over 45 Kelvin. So labs in this PT could quote a measurement uncertainty of perhaps 3K. A lot of labs are much more ambitious in that circumstance. They might report 1K or 0.5K as a measurement uncertainty for temperature rise. And typically the application of this test in real life, so this is what they do for their customers, is for safety. So something can't overheat. And it requires that the temperature rise is less than a certain limit. So a 45K spread in between +3 and Z equals -3, while that might be statistically acceptable, it may not meet the needs of the customer in terms of their product safety. Some laboratories choose to take corrective actions to bring their deviation from the assigned value to within 10K, even though they passed the PT with a Z score as small as 1. So why am I telling you this? Lots of reasons, actually. PTP should bring you technical satisfaction. The degree of right and wrong of a PT result depends on a lot more than the pass-fail statistics. And there are also customer expectations, the laboratory's measurement uncertainty, the needs of the method, various regulations. And so I think one needs to be prepared. So we're going back to this slide. The lab's planning for PT can and should include your planned expectations for the acceptance of PT, not only for the plans of participation. Ultimately, it's the laboratory's decision whether their accuracy and precision is adequate. The laboratory's customers should contribute to this, but ultimately it's the lab that decides what the predefined criteria are for their quality assurance. And every day's results need to be right, and the PT only helps you to be assured on that when it's treated like everyday testing. It's just here in writing. So that's it for the presentation, and I'm open to questions or comments or thoughts.
And we do have a couple other questions, and then attendees, if you want to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat box, please feel free to do so. We have about 8 minutes left, so we should be able to address any questions that come in. One question that came in was, should everyone in the laboratory or that performs laboratory activities participate in external PT, or should it be the same person every time?
Well, my question should actually go back to that person. If it's the same person every time, how do you know that Mary, who tests the samples on Sunday afternoons when no one else is around, is sending out correct test results? If you test PT often enough, you can schedule people in so that everyone gets a turn. Or you can divvy up the testing. Well, certainly the staff that are booking in samples should be booking in the PT exactly like they book in every other sample. That's my opinion. Like, you can't do a proficiency program and pretend that it's just like your normal testing if all of the normal things don't happen to the PT.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you there. So kind of a follow-up question to that, you kind of alluded to this, checking in the sample or booking in the sample. What if the sample container that the proficiency test provider gave to the laboratory for that external PT looks different than what they normally receive? How would they treat that as a normal sample?
Well, if they're receiving, if I'm thinking about a consulting lab that receives things from multiple different customers, then obviously the lab needs to be able to handle whatever. It just depends how different it really is. So certainly, if the container is, for example, we run a water program, so drinking water, and yes, that comes as freeze-dried vials. I know that some of our customers have their a separate staff who just quietly make the sample up and then put it through the system, so that when the lab gets it, they're getting a litre of water. But other people, I don't know what other people do. I don't think that it necessarily needs to be anything, but if you got something unusual in real life, you wouldn't be putting one person in the hot seat to handle that sample, would you? Surely you would be consulting with a group of people and saying, oh, I've got this kind of container here. Is that going to mean that I have to handle the sample differently? So whatever would happen in normal life, you try to make it as equivalent as possible when you do your PT sample. Did I answer that well enough, or?
Yes, I think so. We also just had a comment to follow that up. It says, seems like everyone should do a PT. We do that in forensics labs. And yes, the forensics labs have additional requirements on them that actually say they have to for the disciplines that they're qualified for. So yeah, thanks for that comment. And then another question that may be difficult to answer, it can be a variety of different things here, but what is a reasonable cost for a PT sample or program? I'm thinking for the laboratory. I know I kind of chuckled when I saw that too, because there are so many different types of PTs, right?
Yeah. Look, I think that the cost of a PT, you could set your own limits. Like I don't know how people do their budgets for PT. Actually, I do know how people do their budgets for PT. Some management gives the labs a certain budget, and they say they can buy their PT within that budget. But certainly there are a lot of PT that I know are prohibitively expensive. So the concept of doing a PT every month, or to have things on hand for everyday use, you'd never do a PT every day. But for some people, that would be, with some providers, that would be prohibitive. You just wouldn't be able to do that. But the more you make it be something so special, the harder it is to make it reflect your everyday. So I don't know. I think lots of our customers participate in at least 6 or 7 programs a year, because they want to cover everything. They want to make sure they're looking at lots of different angles. They're giving their staff opportunities to participate. So I think that it still comes up to the lab and what they're prepared to do. I can't really quote a dollar value on what's a good price for a PT.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, we don't have any other questions in the chat or the Q&A. Ingrid, I want to thank you so much for presenting on proficiency testing for us today. It was a very enjoyable talk. I learned a lot. Do you have any parting words you'd like to end this webinar with?
Not particularly. I'd just like to thank everybody for their attention, and you never know, we might meet again. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And again, everyone, this was recorded and it will be up on our website as soon as the recording is available. Thank you all for attending, and keep an eye out for our next webinar, which will be next month.